My son is a horse. You laugh. No, I don't mean that his attitude or his behavior resembles that of an equine. It's not a metaphor. No, I mean he's a real galloping, mane-having, foam-sweating horse. So yeah, I was asleep one night, and I woke up and I rolled over, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I noticed that the television was still on. And even though I was a little groggy, I managed to focus my eyes on the images that were on the screen. And it was a reporter talking about some sort of experiment that had gone wrong. Some sort of DNA consciousness transference through drug use. Some sort of half horse, half man creature. So I kept listening. And the voice of the horse sounded familiar. By the way, the horses could talk. And it sounded like it was my son's voice. So I sat up in the bed and I looked closer. And the closer I looked and the more I listened, I realized it was him. Now, of course, I was more than perplexed. I was in denial. I was in unbelief. And it took me a moment to actually figure out if I was like looking at a parody or something, like maybe it was Saturday Night Live or it was Comics Gone Wild or fake news. But I kept on listening. And I realized that this was real. And my son was actually a horse. Now, as a parent, when your children turn out in a particular way, one that feels a little questionable, you ask, what did I do wrong? I mean, because we all try to set guidelines and we have expectations and hopes for our kids, none of which they would become a horse. And I used to think that perhaps he would go into the family business, what I did for a living, follow my footsteps, because in arts and entertainment, everybody in my family is a singer, musician, actor, writer, in front of the camera, behind the camera. Because I really thought that, my lifestyle would have been, suggestive to him. Because from the time he was 3 months old, he traveled with me on the road everywhere I went. When I did plays or live stage shows, he was right there. He had his own passport when he was 9 months old. We traveled all over the world. We went to Japan. We went to Australia. We went to England, all over the U.S. He had a childhood that most would have envied. So now, I asked myself, how did this happen? This turning into a horse thing. Because I thought I had set a good example, led a good life, and his exposure to showbiz, chaperoned by me, and interpreted in a morally responsible way, was good, I thought. But sometimes I do think that it might have been my fault, what happened to him. Perhaps he was like, maybe traumatized from my lifestyle. Like the time I took him when he was 8 years old to see Michael Jackson at the Shrine Theater. And I was on that same show. I was singing backup for Smokey Robinson, the king of Motown. Let's see. I guess you say, come on, what can make me feel this way? My girl, my girl, my girl. Talking about my girl, my girl. Very good. Very good. Very good. That was my main job for about 30 years. And so, he had been with me everywhere. Now, when we first entered the venue earlier that day, I had introduced him to all of the security guards, all of the authorities, people that were standing around there. He had on his backstage pass. He had on another thing that I had pinned on to him with his name, his address, his phone number, his mama's name, everything. Because it was going to be an all-day affair, you know, makeup, costumes, blocking, all this. It was a show, Dick Clark Productions, Living Legends. That's what it was. So he was good to go. So he just hung out with me. And he was pretty much on his own. He knew the rules of the road, you know, and he was wandering through the dressing rooms and backstage and in the wings and all that. So when the show is over, there was this huge after party. Now, if anyone has ever been backstage at a shrine, it's ginormous back there. It's like another whole venue back there. And they were having this fabulous party with all the beautiful people, the Hollywood types and the wannabes and the looky-loos and the fans and people who had snuck back there and some of the celebrities, right? And so I go to find him, and I discovered that he's sitting in the middle of these wild Hollywood types, punk rockers, I think. They all had different color hair and tattoos all over and piercings all over their body. And although not in plain sight, they seemed to have been indulging in some mind-altering substances. And he was sitting in the center of them, giggling, laughing, having a good old time. And they were fawning all over him, right? So when I approached them, I was calm. I felt like I had an objective, non-judgmental aura about me. But I besieged him to follow me because it was time to go home. Gig was over. I was tired. It was time to go home. Now, in my mind's eye, looking back over this, it didn't seem necessarily shocking at the time. It was no more than he would have seen on TV or walking down the street, actually. But years later, he tells me that one of the girls that was sitting there had holes right here. And you could see everything. He was 8 years old now. So now I didn't see that. And that made me think, what else didn't I see all those years? So as he grew up, I found myself routinely checking in on him psychologically, you know, questioning his thoughts, his motivations, and his choices, and making comments about things that I thought needed to be corrected. But you know, when they get to a certain age and that bedroom door is closed and you go there very, you know, tenderly and you knock, you say, hey, sorry to bother you, son, but just checking up on you, been in there all day. Now, he was always super inquisitive, even as a child. He always seemed to gravitate to the business side of the business. And he had the gift of gab. And instead of hanging out with my musician friends, he used to hang out with the promoters and the producers of the shows. And he would always be talking his way in and out of things. Any job or position that he took, he would work his way right up to the top, surpassing all his peers, hanging out with the big dogs, the bosses, the CEOs, the presidents of the company. I had falsely assumed that his association with artists of all types and his world travel would have made him the kind of person who was not easily led or enticed or impressed. But this time, I guess he talked his way into something that he couldn't get out of. And just like so many of our children in this day and age, my son was hoodwinked, brainwashed, blindsided by a silver-tongued, trash-talking, no empathy having, greedy, make money any way I can, slave-driving predator. A corporation pushing drugs to enhance productivity, who felt they were above regulation, above the law, could do what they wanted, and they did. But I have to say he did take after me in some ways. Because in the late 60s and 70s, I was a card-carrying civil rights protester. I marched. I sat in, I prayed in, I laid in, and I helped, along with others, elect some of the country's very first African-American mayors and congressmen. And my son My son, the horse, became quite a vocal leader against the horse revolution, against the elite oppressors. I even joined a support group with other parents of horses. And I should have realized what I had gotten myself into in the very beginning when the leader of the group started the meeting by saying, "Ha! 2 racehorses are in a stable." One says to the other, "You know, before that last race, the one you won?" asked the other horse. "Yeah, before that race, I felt a pinch in my hindquarters." And the other horse says, "Funny, I felt a pinch in my hindquarters before that race I won." Then a dog that was walking by says, "You idiots, you're being doped. They're injecting you with the drug to make you faster." And then the first horse turns to the second one and says, "A talking dog." One thing, though, that we all could agree on was that we had to stick by our children. One of the parents in our group even built stables on his property and connected it to his house so that he could still feel like he was part of the family. He could bring all his horse friends over and they could just gallop and eat and hay and plan their strategy meetings over throwing the people responsible for their present status. I thought it was really thoughtful of that man to do that for his son. But in the end, I had to accept and realize that it really wasn't my fault because everybody makes their own choices. I gave him a good home. I gave him a world of experience and good guidance along the way. And even with all of that, he still became a horse. And you know what? He's still my son. And I love him.